Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our briefing, U.S.-China Engagement and International Climate Diplomacy. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. And this is the third and final installment of our briefing series about what Congress needs to know about COP29. EESI is celebrating 40 years of advancing climate solutions through congressional education. We were founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked our best to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We try really hard to ensure that our resources are timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. And we put a lot of thought into when we time these resources, which is one reason why we're having these briefings now in the lead up to COP29. We want to make sure that our resources are ready before congressional staff even know they need them. And some of our briefings are online like this. Sometimes they're in person on Capitol Hill. Sometimes they're fact sheets, sometimes they're issue briefs, sometimes they're articles, sometimes they're podcasts, and we cover a lot of different ground. We cover budget and appropriations, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act and investments and policies from those, carbon dioxide removal. We had two briefings actually about that this year that were really good, one about dam removal, nature-based solutions. We do like 24 briefings a year, plus a lot of other resources. We cover a lot of ground. And the best way to keep up with everything is to visit us online at www.eesi.org and subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. And when we get to COP29 in November, there's no better resource to stay up to date than our daily newsletter, COP Dispatch. This is the third of three briefings about the upcoming climate negotiations. And if you'd like to start from the beginning, on Wednesday, we covered what's on the table for the negotiations. Yesterday, we took a close look at efforts to monitor and mitigate methane emissions. And while I would not exactly say that those briefings are prerequisites for today, each briefing was extremely informative and not something you would want to miss. So the webcasts and the presentations from those briefings are available at www.eesi.org. And after catching up and watching the entire series, if you happen to be a congressional staff person, please feel free to reach out to me or my colleague Anna McGinn if you have any questions. This year, the UN climate negotiations will take place in Baku, Azerbaijan. This will be the 29th Conference of Parties, or COP29, and our congressional education programming is specifically designed to inform everyone on Capitol Hill and guide policymakers on how to engage with the climate summit effectively. Today, our panelists will explore the role of U.S.-China climate engagement in shaping the progress and outcomes of international climate governance. The dynamics of this engagement are critical, and the relationship between the two countries is pretty complicated. How the U.S. and China get along and find ways to work together has been a significant factor in annual UN climate negotiations, and COP29 will be no different. Last year, for example, in the lead up to COP28 in Dubai, the US and China produced the Sunnylands Statement, which included joint positions that helped set the stage for the multilateral negotiations. Statement covered topics related to the energy transition, forest conservation, non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and methane. It also kicked off a working group focused on climate action in the 2020s. It loomed large over COP28, and the state of bilateral relations between the US and China will be an important factor to watch as COP29 approaches. If you signed up for one of our COP briefings, we will make sure you receive links and summary notes for the entire series to help you prepare for the negotiations and answer tough questions from your boss about what is happening in Baku and why it matters to folks back in your state and district. We have a slide here with a quick survey link. We'll also have it at the end of the presentation. If you have a moment to click that link or take our survey, we really appreciate it. If you have any problems with the presentations today, please let us know. And if you have any feedback or just ideas, we're happy to hear that too. We have three amazing presenters and a special guest, and after we hear from them, we will have time for questions. For folks in our online audience, you can submit questions to us by emailing us at that's ask@eesi.org. You can also tweet at us at EESI Online. Be sure to follow us on social media at EESI Online. We're going to be doing real-time coverage on X as well as on our Instagram story. I mentioned a special guest, and we have a very special guest. Representative Kathy Castor, who represents the 14th District of Florida, is joining us today via pre-recorded video remarks. Representative Castor is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and previously led the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. She joins us today because of her commitment to advancing climate solutions and also because she holds a position as a senior member of the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. Representative Castor, thank you so much for joining us for our briefing today.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Florida, the former chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and a current member of the Select Committee on the Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you to the Environmental and Energy Study Institute for the opportunity to kick off the briefing about what Congress needs to know about COP29 and the role of U.S.-China engagement in shaping global climate policy. Issues ranging from climate finance to adaptation to methane mitigation are critical in order to make progress. And the leadership of the United States, Congress, NGOs, and our business partners is indispensable in shaping the outcome of the conference. The U.S.-China relationship is complex. Although our countries and economies are connected, we are often competitors ranging from critical mineral supply chains to clean energy and transportation technology. But to meet our shared emissions targets, including the Paris Agreement's goal of keeping global warming under 2 degrees Celsius, we will also need to cooperate, reduce pollution, and lead on climate action together. The severe impacts and costs of the climate crisis are already being felt across the United States and the globe. Climate-fueled disasters like Hurricanes Helene and Milton in my backyard have claimed lives and caused tens of billions of dollars in damages. These impacts hit working families, small businesses, and traditionally underrepresented communities the hardest. When you look at these extreme weather events and the climate emergency as a whole, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and discouraged. But we have reason to be hopeful. We recently marked the 2-year anniversary of the passage of our nation's landmark climate and clean energy law, the Inflation Reduction Act. I was proud to stand next to President Biden as he signed into law the largest investment in clean energy and climate resilience in U.S. history. Those investments are paying dividends with new announcements for manufacturing plants and clean energy projects seemingly every day. These projects will not only help us lower pollution, they create jobs, promote energy security, and lower energy bills for American families. Ahead of last year's COP, it was the Sunnylands Statement, highlighting U.S. and China cooperation, that set the tone for more ambitious global action on issues like methane and energy efficiency. China is the 2nd largest economy in the world and the world's largest overseas financier of public infrastructure projects. It is in our shared interest for the U.S. to pursue appropriate opportunities for coordinated investments involving China in clean energy, in sustainable development, and climate resilience. Through platforms like the joint U.S.-China Working Group on Enhancing Climate Action, established last year, we can make progress while ensuring that such investments are fully transparent and meet the highest possible standards. I'm eager to work with my colleagues in Congress to build on the success of the IRA and push the international community to ramp up the speed and scale of global climate mitigation and resilience measures at COP29. Thank you all again. My team and I look forward to hearing from this excellent panel.
Thank you, Representative Castor, for joining us, and thanks for your leadership on these issues. We look forward to working with you and your staff as well. Perfect introduction to a tremendous panel we have today. I'm very pleased to introduce our first panelist, Wanyuan, Section Editor for China at Carbon Brief. Wanyuan, welcome to our briefing today. I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, hi, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor for me to be here, share my knowledge about China and climate change. Is that okay to show the next slide, please? So needless to say that China is the world's biggest emitter and deployer and manufacturer of low carbon technology is absolutely important for the world to combat climate change. Our latest study, is that okay to show the next slide, please? Our latest study shows that China's carbon emissions may have already peaked in 2023. And as you can see on the chart here, this is the second quarter of 2024 of China's carbon emissions. The latest chart of Q3 will be published on our website next Tuesday, but the trend has been quite continuously showing which is the carbon emissions fell. And even though in the third quarter of this year, it doesn't really fall much, but it leaves the door open to 2024 being overall seeing the reduction of emissions. So that makes us think there are three factors behind it, as well as reflecting the trend of carbon emission reduction in China, which is power, industry, and transport. So in China's previous NDC, it says that they want the wind and the solar capacity to surpass 1,200 gigawatts by 2030. This goal has already been met in 2024. Currently, China's wind and solar capacity reached 1,206 gigawatts. So this is because of the expansion of renewable energy, China's demand for the growing demand of electricity has been met, and that drives down the demand for fossil fuels. And at the same time, because of the slowing down economy, it has also offset some carbon emissions. China's real estate sector, as some of you may already know, is very important for the economy overall. Because of the slowing down in the real estate industry, the demand in steel and cement has also been slowing down. And those two are high emitters. So that makes the overall emission kind of reducing as well. Another thing I want to mention is the rapid growth cell of what China calls new energy vehicles, which are largely electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, China's sale of new EVs has overtaken the sale of new combustion engines this summer, and the sales are still growing. But as some people has already noticed that the EV sector in China heavily relies on the state subsidies, even though some of the state subsidies has already been paused and cancelled. That makes people wonder how sustainable the rapid growth will continue. And this again brings the question about the overcapacity of EVs in China. So I won't go to too much details there, but to just let you know that there are slight questions and uncertainties about how sustainable China's rapid growth in EVs and the demand and the reducing of carbon emissions will last in the next few years. Next slide, please. So overall, because of China's emission may have already peaked and the reflections of different industries, we have noticed that China's policy pendulum may have already swung back to climate change after years of focusing on economic growth. So the first signal that we picked is President Xi calls for green growth in the beginning of this year around the Chinese New Year time. And then in the spring, when China hosted the two sessions, which is the annually most important political meeting in China, climate goals has been reiterated. And then in the summer, the Communist Party's third plenum meeting mentioned about carbon emissions for the first time. Also in this year, China has created some new terms such as the new quality productive forces and the new threes. All of them put the renewable energy and EVs, kind of green technology, as the new driving force of China's economy. Next slide, please. So to be more specific when it comes to the change of carbon and climate related policies, China has changed its dual control of carbon intensity to dual control of carbon emissions. So I need to explain a tiny bit here. The carbon intensity is closely related to the carbon emissions of per unit of GDP. And kind of like a twin concept is the energy intensity. Energy intensity is the energy consumption per unit of GDP. So both of the concepts that China has been using for years as the standard really is for the economy to grow while at the same time tackling the emissions problem. But 2023 saw the first time that China didn't really met its carbon intensity goal, and that is because of the economy growth is slower than energy consumption. So China has now made a new announcement saying that now the carbon intensity and the emission intensity while only focusing on fossil fuels, making it easier for the industry and the nationwide policymakers to meet the targets. However, there are evidence shows that China is still going to very likely miss the targets. And so now China changed the system to the dual control for carbon emissions, which added the overall carbon emissions to the standard and when it comes to checking the local officers how they performed. So this definitely shows China's ambition to do more when it comes to tackling emissions. At the same time, China wants the market to play a role. So they expanded its ETS, which is the emission trading system, from just covering the energy sector to now aluminum and cement and other industries. So the covering rate now from 40% of the total emissions of CO2 to 60%. At the same time, they relaunched the CCER, which is the voluntary trading market, linking the CCER with green electricity certificates, which is the certificate that allows people to trade and retrade green electricities. So those moves definitely shows that China wants the market, which previously didn't play a big role, to participate on tackling climate change. And then there are two long-awaited environmental and energy law that may come into force this year. At the same time, industrial-wise, they have stopped giving new permissions to steel that use the coal, and also paused a scheme of steel swapping scheme that is to slowing down the expansion of steel capacity, and so is the coal plant approvals. But I have to point out that China, even though the coal permissions for construction slowed down 80% last year, China is still leading the world when it comes to coal constructions. Next slide, please. So to kind of conclude what I have talked earlier, so data-wise, China definitely has been putting on quite a lot of effort into tackling climate change, and policy-wise, so the National Energy Administration official data says China invested $676 billion in 2023 in the energy transition, claiming to be the world's largest investment last year. And outside China, they promised $51 billion to Africa to sell advanced and green technology. And this is moving their focus away from traditional investment in infrastructure, that's road, bridges, airports, etc. So what happens next? So China has been doing quite a lot, but some research think tanks think China can do more. So China could cut CO2 emissions to at least 30% below the 2023 level by 2035, and its non-CO2 emissions by 35. So what is vital is how China is going to deliver promise at COP29, and what China writes in its next NDC, and to kind of clarify what pathway China wants to pursue to reach net zero. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Wanyuan. That was an awesome presentation and great slides. As a reminder, all of the presentation materials and the webcast of the briefing today is available at www.eesi.org. So if you'd like to go back and rewatch the presentation or review the slides, easy to do, we've got you covered. And that applies to our next two panelists as well, of course. Next up is Jennifer Turner. Jennifer is the director of the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. Jennifer, welcome to our briefing today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks. Super happy to be here. All right. We're going to move fast because we want to cover a lot of material, and I want to get your questions later. So cracks in the climate cooperation between the United States. Now, I often like to say that long ago in a galaxy far, far away, next slide, the US and China used to cooperate on climate change. Back in 2009, the Obama-Hu Clean Energy Agreements, next, led to what I often call the climate and air quality ping pong between the two, that we had multi-agency cooperation. We were never giving aid or assistance to them, but we worked together across a whole range of issues. Next slide. But I want to point out that we had these agreements, and the supporting foundation of this bilateral climate cooperation is the US-China Science and Technology Cooperative Agreement. Covers not just energy and climate type issues. Actually, the very first area of cooperation was agriculture. Next slide. But besides the formal agreement, there's also what I think is the super strong and long-standing foundation from US NGOs, foundations, national labs, which I know are federal, but hey, universities, think tanks, states. So all of these, and I have it's a partial list here of these organizations that have been working with China, oftentimes on subnational level. Next slide. And so this, both the bottom up, the subnational, the national level cooperation, the climate agreements, led to, particularly in the Obama administration, a race to the top opportunities in areas like building energy efficiency. Lawrence Berkeley National Lab led a clean energy research center that brought together lab people from both countries, businesses, and NGOs to look at ways to make buildings more energy efficiency. Gave US business investment opportunities in China. It was a great example of how, we pushed each other. Next slide. In terms of capacity building at the subnational, California really did help drive the EVs in China by sharing with China about how the zero vehicle program that they had, the kinds of incentives. And then China, as we know, invested quite heavily in EVs, and they lead the world. Next slide. Another kind of race to top opportunity which really helped push the United States to do more was on solar power. One of my interns made this slide back in 2016, so it is dated, but I like that it shows that we started really investing a lot in solar power, wind as well, China twice as much. And back then, a lot of the electricity China installed, you see a little garbage can, it was like garbage solar because the grid hadn't been built up. China has since built the grid up, and so they are not wasting their energy as much. They're also investing heavily in batteries, as Wanyuan mentioned. Next slide. So what did all this bring? In 2014, the US-China climate agreement really paved the way for the Paris Climate Agreement. We are the world's energy and greenhouse gas emitting superpowers. And when the two countries come together, cooperate, a little bit of competition in there as well, it moved mountains. It led to the Paris Agreement. Next slide. In 2017, the doors on the formal bilateral cooperation were shut, with the Trump administration pulling us out, starting the process of pulling us out of Paris. In the same time, Xi Jinping stepped forward and said that, we will be the leader on international climate cooperation. While in that same year, China passed their foreign NGO registration law, which did make it somewhat difficult for some across the spectrum NGOs to continue their operations there. But there are still many US NGOs, NRDC, WWF, World Resource Institute, Environmental Defense Fund, and others that are working in China with their counterparts on clean energy and climate. Next slide, moving along. So China is still leading the world in installed renewable energy capacity because they are #1 in investment. You've heard about solar panels, onshore wind, electric vehicles, but offshore wind, China, again, blowing records. Now, Europeans used to be #1. Now China has installed 50% of the world's offshore wind. They're looking to do investments more in Europe, and not sure yet about in the global south, but it is a possibility. But they're really investing heavily in this sector. Next slide. So they've continued, as Wanyuan mentioned, that thriving on electric vehicles at home, really done in great part for the air quality issue, because that also drove the bilateral cooperation. Greenhouse gas emissions, important, but for the Chinese policymakers and public, cleaning up the air in cities was vital. Next slide. The US, we have hit the gas, pun intended, on EVs and clean energy investments and the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act. So, we're on the road, this kind of race, but we probably can't totally catch up with China, but the market in the world for electric vehicles and clean energy goes way beyond what China could even invest in. So we have a potential to be a leader in this space as well. Next slide. One of the bumps on the road, again, pun intended, on US-China kind of cooperation on clean energy is China's monopoly on critical minerals. Should be pointed out that it was under Deng Xiaoping where he said, OPEC, they reign in the oil sphere. We can do rare earths. And so China for 30 plus years has been investing along the whole supply chain in critical minerals and rare earths. So they do control it, and that is a concern. I flagged this book here on the side, The War Below, and I'll give the link to the EESI folks. I had a conversation with the author that really talks about the nuances about the challenges we're having in the battle for getting lithium and copper and other critical minerals going here and cooperation abroad, an issue that I know that it has a big interest to the audience here. Next slide. Just a little summary that the debate now about decoupling from China on clean tech, that integration does raise concerns of national security, job and IPR losses. We have 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. The Europeans are doing the same. But a lot of people in my network who I talk with think that there needs to be more of a nuanced discussion about, well, what is national security? Is every critical mineral a problem? And also we focus very heavily on the competition and threats from their dominance on renewables and critical minerals. There are other areas, I'll highlight a few shortly, and I think Kate will after me, where we could work together that maybe aren't as strategic or sensitive. But by cutting our relationship, and even this kind of competition that we had with China on clean energy, is that it could lead to less innovation and higher prices and lower climate action on both sides. Next slide. Well, we have had, we still are continuing the cooperation. Our hardworking climate envoys did bring the 2021 Glasgow and 23 Sunnylands Agreement. Next slide. And one of the areas where there may be many less sensitivities are on short-lived climate pollutants. They dominate both agreements. There's lots of methane reduction areas in oil and gas and coal bed methane that it brings better business, great climate action in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, big business benefits to both countries on working together on lowering HFCs. Next slide. And this is something that has nothing to do with the climate agreement, but last year we had the first Trans-Pacific Green Shipping Corridor launched. And it came about, an example of this kind of subnational cooperation that's been percolating for decades. The ports of Shanghai, LA, and Long Beach, together with other companies, they partnered with I think it's global, US-based C40, to come together to look at opportunities for our countries to come up with the cities and the ports to come up with renewable energy, cleaner fuels, energy efficiency on shipping vessels that could really bring down the emissions, not only of greenhouse gas, but of pollutants. Next slide. And closing up here, just want to mention that for the first time, the US and China put food and agriculture on the climate table. 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions come from food and agriculture. Next slide. And in this area, the US and China, we are food superpowers, and our emissions in this area is only moving higher. Next slide. One thing that's striking here in this space, the US and agricultural trade and our economies are interlinked. China is the largest purchaser of our grain. We buy from them. So we're not competing head to head on the same products in most cases. Next slide. We also, as Representative Castor noted, that we are facing climate threats from disasters, heat, and our food sectors are impacted quite deeply on both sides of the Pacific. Next slide. So 2 years ago at the Wilson Center, we started our Cool Agriculture project that's been looking into, well, what are the greenhouse gas emissions in US and China in food and ag, and what are potential areas for cooperation? Next slide. And so we identified 4 areas of, yes, low-hanging fruit. It would be soil sequestration, rice methane. Next slide. Food waste, we're kind of almost neck and neck per capita. China's actually losing a lot more in terms of food loss up on the farm, and also dairy cows. There's scientists already and NGOs working together, looking into technologies both at home and sometimes even together in these spaces. Next slide. Another thing that potentially propels this as a good area of cooperation, both countries signed on to the Food and Ag Climate Declaration last year at the COP. So both countries are committed to put low carbon, low methane food action plans and in our climate action plan. So next slide, it opens the door for cooperation, and I look forward in the Q&A for taking your questions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Not only did you mention building energy efficiency, which always earns brownie points in EESI panels, maybe you did your homework. Thank you also for the cow pun. I always appreciate those. I've been on best behavior. I mean, we did a whole briefing yesterday about methane and I didn't make a single joke. So it's been best behavior this week, but I really appreciated that. Amazing presentation as well. Folks in our online audience, if you have questions, we'll have a Q&A period after our next presenter. You can send us an email with your question, and the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. That brings us to Kate Logan. Kate is the director of the China Climate Hub and Climate Diplomacy of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and also a fellow at the Center for China Analysis. Kate, welcome to our briefing today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thanks so much to EESI for hosting today's briefing. I can't promise to match Jennifer's level of puns, but hopefully can add some additional context. No one obviously can match your puns on how U.S.-China climate engagement relates to the UNFCCC process, which is the process on the UN climate negotiations. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I think Jennifer did a really good job of covering the extent of the history of cooperation between the US and China. And I want to highlight this. There's sort of two key components. What Jennifer highlighted a lot of focused more on technical exchanges that have basically motivated both sides to move faster in their own domestic emissions reductions. But at the same time, another core component, sort of the second piece, has been US and China coming together and working to find consensus within the context of the UN negotiations on what are really tough negotiating issues, but absolutely essential to putting forth an agreement, noting that within the context of the negotiations, all countries in the world have to come to consensus for that to move forward. So obviously extremely difficult in practice, and the relationship between the US and China is particularly difficult in part because when the UN FCCC was set up in the early 1990s, it basically bifurcated the world into developed and developing countries based on who was developed at that point in time. So the fact that China's in this developing country bucket, and then, obviously with its emissions increasing and it becoming the world's largest annual emitter around 2006, the US and other countries around the world, knowing that all countries have to reduce their emissions if we're going to be able to meet our climate target. So going back into the history, Jennifer referenced the cooperation in the lead up to the Paris Agreement that was really critical in sort of turning around what had earlier been a more contentious relationship and unlock those negotiations. Obviously, that fell off during the Trump administration when the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but the Biden administration has really placed a lot of effort on reestablishing that cooperation, and the Sunnylands Statement has already been referenced. So next slide, please. As going back into basically what's been happening the last year. So earlier in the Biden administration in Glasgow in 2021, both countries put forward a joint statement. And then last year, a couple days before President Biden, President Xi met in San Francisco in November, both countries put forward the Sunnylands Statement that had a lot of really strong new commitments, but in particular, both countries came to a consensus on some of the contours for expectations around the key negotiating item at COP28 in Dubai, which was the first global stocktake, which is basically this process for countries to assess how much progress has been made toward the Paris Agreement's goals and how much more needs to be done to close the gap between what's actually happening in practice and what needs to happen. So within that, they also agreed to certain commitments in a bilateral context as well. So in this past year, they've stood up this US-China working group. The Chinese climate envoy, Liu Jianmin, who is the successor to the previous envoy, Xie Zhenhua, came to the US in May. US and China held this big subnational event also in May in California as well. And then in September, John Podesta, who's the current high-level official from the US on climate diplomacy, visited China. So they've been engaging throughout the year, not just on that high level, also on a number of different technical levels as well within the context of the working group. Next slide, please. In the lead up to COP29 next month. So the working group covers a number of specific issues, including energy transition and transition away from specifically in the China context, also circular economy, subnational cooperation, and supply chain linked deforestation. But in the context of the negotiations, a couple other issues that I want to highlight specifically that I'll go into more detail on, which are first, both countries' next climate targets, which are due early next year. Second, the biggest negotiating item this year, which is this new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. We know we love our acronyms in the UNFCCC world. So this is basically just the big goal on climate finance that countries will agree to going forward. And then also substantive action on non-carbon dioxide pollutants, especially methane, as Jennifer referenced, as well as some other super pollutants. And both countries agreed to co-host a summit for the second time at COP29 next month with the presidency, which is Azerbaijan. They also held a similar summit last year in Dubai at COP28. Next slide, please. So just sort of giving a couple of specific examples of how this cooperation helps to unlock the negotiations. These are some of the different components that have been put out in the readouts from the meetings this year, where both sides agreed to certain text and commitments that sort of sets a floor for expectations for all countries. So you'll note up front on nationally determined contributions, these climate commitments for both the US and China, they've agreed that they'll submit, or they're committed to submitting their next NDCs on time by the deadline early next year. They'll be economy-wide, include all greenhouse gases, so not just carbon dioxide, and also be aligned with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree temperature goal. And the US and China also agreed to engage in technical and policy exchange around their NDCs, which is critically important for raising expectations and ambition, hopefully, in terms of what we might expect to see from China, as well as what other countries around the world expect to see from the US. Also, energy transition, the engagement has led to reaffirmation of commitments that both countries have made on their power sector emissions reductions. I already referenced the summit on methane and non-CO2 gases. And then also just noting that both countries have been very explicit about their intention to come to a successful outcome at COP29, especially on this new global climate finance goal, which is not an easy negotiation, but really, really important for what happens going forward, especially on a global scale where you have many developing countries and climate vulnerable countries that need finance to be able to both implement their emissions reductions, but also to be able to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate going forward. So next slide, please. Putting this all in the context of COP29, next slide, please. Want to dive a little bit deeper into three key issues. The first of that being the nationally determined contributions, and just up front highlighting that this is not actually a negotiating item specifically in the context of this COP, but it's a really important moment because given the deadline next February, which is basically supposed to be a number of months ahead of the COP next year in Brazil, COP30, to give countries time to analyze and scrutinize the commitments are put forth. This year, next month, will be sort of the first high-level moment where we expect to see major emitters starting to put forward their targets, which will set expectations for what we expect to see from all major emitters around the world. So the science that was just put out this week says that if we don't increase ambition and start implementing these commitments, we're basically on track for a temperature rise of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. Which is pretty terrifying. And obviously China is the world's largest emitter, about a third of global emissions, critically important. And specifically in the context of China's current commitment, because China is committed to peak its emissions before 2030, this next commitment, which is expected to cover the time period out to 2035, will be the first time that China is expected to come forward in the international context with a target that covers absolute emissions reduction. So basically what happens after China hits that emissions peak, and the pace at which China reduces its emissions will be extremely consequential for the global carbon budget. And some analysis, for instance, has showed that if China were to peak and plateau its emissions versus if it peaks and reduces those emissions meaningfully after the peak, could amount to the difference of basically whether the US reaches net zero immediately versus in 2050. So just think about that in the context of the global carbon budget and the impact that it could have. Next slide, please. So again, just in the context of US-China, this engagement is basically what's been critical for enabling both sides to be clear about the contours of what they expect to include in those new commitments. I mentioned the economy-wide, include all greenhouse gases and reflect the 1.5-degree target. So just in terms of China's target, things to watch for. One piece is the headline target. So how much does China reduce emissions? We put forward research showing that to align with 1.5, we'd expect to see at least 30% reductions from the peak, but that's also really tall order given all the economic challenges in China right now. So just acknowledging that, given the challenges in economic stimulus and other areas, it is difficult for China to figure out how to move on that at the same time as climate action, but also certainly still possible and absolutely critical. Second piece is whether or not China reduces from the peak versus a specific base year. And the more specificity there, the better, in the sense that if the peak is ambiguous and not defined, then it's really difficult to measure the emissions reductions. And then finally, how China includes commitments on other sectors like expansion in renewable energy and other non-CO2 gases in its target. Next slide, please. Second is the key negotiating item, which is this new goal on global climate finance, which will basically replace the current existing goal from 2009 for developed countries to mobilize 100 billion per year in global climate finance that was extended to 2025 as part of the Paris Agreement, but then also countries agreed to set a new goal from that floor by next year. And the key challenge here is, again, what I mentioned about the bifurcation in terms of developed versus developing countries, that under the previous goal, only developed countries from the early 90s under the UN structure are required to contribute. But there are a lot of countries, including China, that have developed immensely since then and are actually already contributing to global climate finance. It's just not captured in the context of that goal. So the challenge here will basically be, how do you capture that climate finance that is already flowing, especially from those countries that have the means to contribute, but maybe are doing so in a way that's still somewhat different and could improve them both quality and quantity going forward. So not just China, other countries like Singapore, the Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, whatnot, ideally would be contributing to this new goal. But there may have to be differentiation in some of the aspects like transparency reporting to be able to help those countries build the capacity on those aspects going forward. And the US and China have been engaging on this to hopefully come to a successful outcome. Next slide, please. And then finally, just wrapping up, two other issues to watch. I mentioned the summit, specifically industrial nitrous oxide, a very niche but impactful area where US-China engagement could potentially lead to very concrete progress, and then also subnational cooperation as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, just want to acknowledge that even though I highlighted just a very few specific issues, there's a lot of other areas that will be negotiated on at the COP, including Article 6, which will set rules for global carbon markets, where the US and China actually align a little bit more than some of the other areas and are committed to a successful outcome. So with that, thanks so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kate. That was a great presentation. Before I get into the questions that, and there's still time to submit online questions too, you said something in your presentation, and I don't really want to put you too much on the spot, and so maybe Jennifer and Wanyuan would also have something to say. You talked about economic conditions in China. Is it even possible to give a quick overview of like a little bit more detail about what you mean by that for folks in our audience who might not be as familiar with sort of like the domestic Chinese economy right now? And again, everyone's welcome to chime in if you'd like, but I'll start with you, Kate, since you're the one who mentioned it.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and then definitely keen to hear from others as well. So I think the key challenge here is that traditionally, as China has grown economically, its emissions have also grown, right? Because the structure of China's economy is very manufacturing intensive. So you have a lot of heavy industry that essentially, as they produce more, they also produce more emissions. So the challenge with decarbonization is basically, how do you decouple the emissions piece from the economic growth piece, right? Which in practice, part of that has been done by adding immense amounts of renewable energy to the grid. So cutting into the actual structure of where you're getting your power from. So you're getting it from clean sources. So, for instance, if industry is growing and they're getting all their energy from clean sources, then you're not hypothetically in practice increasing emissions. But then also, in practice, how do you do this in a way that also relates to some of the other challenges with energy security and real challenges that impact people on the ground? So even, for instance, climate impacts like shortages in hydropower and droughts, leading more people, also heat waves, to buy air conditioners that increase the load on the overall grid. So just the intersection of all these challenges is really difficult, but certainly something that China is addressing and making concerted efforts on. And the point that I'd emphasize here is that China, because of their structure, their political system, it's not like they're backtracking on their goals in a lot of ways. They're putting targets forth and trying to figure out how to move forward on them, but not in the way where the US political system sort of, has more room to go in different directions depending on what's happening at what time. So in terms of the US side engaging with China on this, I think it is really important to show that we're committed as well to our climate action here. And that helps to drive China forward. But yeah, keen to hear from others as well.
Jennifer, if you have anything you'd like to add, and Wanyuan also, if you have anything to add, please feel free.
Well, I think that in terms of like China's potential action on food and agriculture, I mean, they don't have any concrete goals yet, but what they're very concerned that whether or not because when you do take some action, for example, in switching from tilling to non-tilling, that there could be a time that your yield will go down, and that's a big no-no in China. But what I was really struck with over the past few years, while it's not really on the front lines of the action, formal action, but I think that's going to change soon. We have seen a lot of Chinese scientists, even US NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, EDF, that are both active on climate action and ag in the US, that they're starting to engage more in this space. So I think that there is an opportunity, but again, there's been similar concerns in the US, right? We don't want our yields to go down, but in the long run, a lot of the climate action that we do as a world, it makes food more secure in the long run in a changing climate.
Yeah, also to add some points from here. So some of the countries, for example, the United States, the country probably would rely on customer, like ordinary people's spendings on economy more, whereas in China is more like manufacturing heavy. So that also brings connecting the point of what the importance between the US-China cooperation in general that would help China to kind of solve its slowing down economy. So that is the first thing that I want to mention here. And China's economy right now is not doing very well. So the Chinese government has been pulling out some stimulation packages, and those packages for climate change in particularly are not very, very environmentally friendly, because some of the stimulations are encouraging people to buy more, say, washing machines, these kind of things that would, not really helping to offset carbons. So that is the first thing I want to mention. And also because of this, so it's not really going to help the offsetting carbon emissions in this way. So China's economy overall slowing down may help to some degree to reduce emissions from the real estate and the manufacturing sector, but at the same time, because they want people to spend more money on ordinary goods, that is not really going to help carbon emissions.
Great. Thanks. I think that's really important, because I think that helps us understand, what the Chinese negotiators will be thinking about when they come to these agreements, right? Understanding the other side of these. So that was super helpful. I'd like to ask a question now about, we're focused on climate today, but there's a lot of other stuff. And of course, climate is kind of everything, but things still tend to get siloed. And so to the extent that the US and China have tensions in other areas, how do those tensions between the US and China impact climate issues and affect our ability to work with them constructively? And Wanyuan, maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll hear from Jennifer and from Kate.
Sure, definitely. So, I mean, it's quite obvious when China and the US relationship kind of slowed down, the intention raises, we can see that the cooperation between scientists and scholars in climate change field also kind of died down away, although they still continue, but the activities has been reduced severely. So this definitely affects it. And also at the same time, you need to kind of keep in mind of China's unique political system. So when the central government kind of sends a signal that is not really having a honeymoon with a certain country, the local governments also picks up the signal, and they kind of reduces its interactions with that country. So when it comes to state-owned companies and the private sectors, they are more cautious of whether they would be, even to say, punished by if they reach out to the olive branches to a country or some other other companies to cooperate with. So if the US-China overall relationship is not in a very good state, then I can kind of like predict that the cooperation in the climate world is also going to suffer.
Jennifer?
Yeah, well, I think that I agree with everything that Wanyuan Song just said. Also want to highlight that the S&T agreement, that's the foundation of all basic and environmental, et cetera, science cooperation, that I think it was not extended most recently. And I think that has an impact well beyond the climate space as well. But it means that as we move our climate negotiations forward, the EPA and the DOE, they can't actually do anything with their counterparts until that gets signed. So it's one of those bumps. What can I say? And as I mentioned in my presentation, that in the long run, trying to pull so many, like we're trying to de-risk and pull apart, that we're going to miss opportunities to cooperate in areas that aren't sensitive.
Yeah, I think coming on that, 3 points from my end. The first is that certainly it impacts the relationship. And I think most notably when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan in 2022, China decided to suspend climate talks and they were later reinstated. But certainly from that perspective, even though the US has tried to silo the cooperative piece from other pieces, that's not necessarily the same way that China approaches it. That said, I think it's really important to emphasize that we can cooperate and compete at the same time. The two are not mutually exclusive. I think the current state of the relationship actually goes to serve as a reflection of that, in the sense that my third point is that if you look at the climate talks that I emphasized in my presentation, the fact that there are trade tensions in so many areas with China, but those are not bleeding into those talks in a very explicit way. It's something that probably has come up, points are raised, but we're still able to cooperate on the negotiations and all these different technical areas that both myself and Jennifer mentioned, sort of serves to reflect that, both can happen at the same time and that there is still room for cooperation, but we still need to be really cultivating the space for it.
Thanks. That was great. That was really, really interesting. Next question I wanted to ask was, I'm not a China scholar by any stretch, and so I'm not an international relations expert by any stretch, but my sense is that when a lot of people, including people on Capitol Hill, think about US-China relations, it doesn't take very long to become very black and white and very binary. Is it good or is it bad? For folks on the Hill, for folks in the media who are going to be following US-China relations over the course of the next couple of weeks, a month or so, actually. And Jennifer, maybe we'll start with you this time, and then we'll hear from Kate, and then we'll, go through the order. What are some suggestions of nuance or context that you would encourage people to keep in mind as they're reading stories that have gone through, like, mainstream journalism, where things tend to get distilled, maybe that kind of feed into this narrative that, in fact, the relationship is binary. It's either good or it's bad, or we're either good or they're bad, or, all of that kind of, places where that nuance and context might otherwise be lost.
Yeah, well, I think it makes us, as I've said before, maybe miss opportunities to cooperate where there actually is no competition. That we, I gave you some examples, of course, on the food and agriculture, maybe even hydrogen. That the fact is that by closing the door, we will miss opportunities, like giving up, cooperation with them, where, China, maybe, they do move very fast and they invest a lot. And for many years, China, like early in the Obama administration, China became kind of a laboratory for experimentation on clean tech, but also on the policy side, and that's where China did learn a lot from us on the policies, and the policies that, that we sprout in this country a lot of times are promoting things like transparency, participation, and those could be good things that could, help China and help the world more broadly in the climate space.
Yeah, I think sort of building on that couple pieces. One is that because China has moved so fast in certain areas, sometimes we forget that there's actually a lot that we in the US can be learning from China. So the fact that China is a land of contradictions in the sense that even though they have this massive build out of coal-fired power at the same time that the world's largest build out of renewable energy, and especially their leadership in certain sectors that even though they've become politicized in terms of solar and EVs and batteries because of considerations from an economic and jobs perspective, which, on one hand makes sense, there's still a lot to be learned from Chinese innovation as well at the same time. And I think also just keeping in mind that, China is a land of people, the US is a land of people, people-to-people exchanges are critically important, and that there's a lot of people in the China context who are doing really good work trying to move the government faster on climate. And that we shouldn't discount all of that incredible work that they are doing within a very difficult context as well. And then finally, just the fact that this engagement has led to tangible outcomes and progress. So don't forget that as well.
And Wanyuan,
Sure. Yeah, I agree with what Jennifer and Kate said. Definitely, I think the two countries should, continue working together, not just climate field, but also, everything else. But if there's anything I can add, that is, so China's political system definitely, is Communist Party heavily led, but there are also different voices within the party, and also some people actually share different views as well. So when people, especially US Congress people, when you kind of like talk to Chinese politicians, you should kind of bear in mind that they may actually have some ideas different from what the propaganda machine is talking about. And some of them are actually quite open-minded. So don't, like when you see someone from the Communist Party thinking, oh, they're definitely not going to agree with us. That's not really the case at the same time. And so, yeah, there are actually quite many similarities between US and China. After all, it's people and the people, living in the two countries. So I do wish if you have a chance to cooperate with China, please do so.
Thanks. That was a really great set of presentations. We are getting very close to the hour mark. And when we're on Capitol Hill, usually our briefings are 90 minutes, but when we're doing them online for this series, they're an hour. But I could really listen to this, I could listen to all of you go on, especially if there's more cow jokes and cow puns. There's no limit there. This was excellent. Thank you, Wanyuan, Jennifer, and Kate for tremendous presentations. As a reminder, folks in our audience, if you'd like to go back and rewatch any of the presentations or read any of the presentation materials, visit us online at www.eesi.org. When you do that, sign up for Climate Change Solutions. That comes out every 2 weeks. It's a great way to keep up with everything. But during COP, in particular, COP29, we'll be doing a daily newsletter called COP Dispatch, and we'll be covering these issues, especially where there's a connection to U.S. engagement. So we'll be covering, U.S. actors and participants and at COP29, and we'll absolutely be covering, engagement with Chinese counterparts and others while we're there. So I encourage you to do that. I'd also like to share a very big thanks to Representative Kathy Castor and her great team for making her participation possible. And thanks again for your leadership on these issues. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues at EESI who actually made this briefing series possible. Thanks to Dan O, to Amory, Allison, Anna, Molly, and Nicole. We have 3 awesome fall interns, Jemiah, Josh, and Alia. Thank you for all your work as well. Also, videographers behind the scenes, Lynn and Troy, thank you for making this possible. Anna McGinn, our policy director, and I will be in Baku for both weeks. So if you're going to be there, reach out. If you're part of one of the delegations, staff delegations, if your boss is going, please let us know and we'll do our best to find ways to support and hopefully have a chance to meet up in Azerbaijan, which sounds like a kind of a fun thing to do. Our extensive coverage will continue in a few weeks with our daily newsletter, COP Dispatch. Like I said, sign up for that. And we'll put the slide back up in a moment with the survey link. If you have any feedback about our briefings, whether they're these briefings or other briefings in general, please feel free to take a few moments and share that feedback with us. We read every response and we really appreciate folks who take time to share their feedback. So maybe we won't have the slide. You'll just have to go back and watch a little bit earlier. Take it from me. Oh, there it is. There it is. There's the QR code. Thanks again to everyone. It's Friday at 1 o'clock Eastern, and it's super nice here in DC. I'm going to go find myself some lunch. Hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. TGIF, and have a great weekend too. Thanks, everyone.